welcome back everybody to another episode of New Agreements. This is the podcast where we try to ask, if we had blank slate, if we had all the power, what new agreements should we have in society, in our households, or even in our own personal resolve, how we're going to be in the world. What new agreements should we have in that world that helps us to flourish together? And I have been on a journey of asking a bunch of people who know about certain pockets of knowledge in the world or are learning about them themselves to sort of have a conversation with me and discuss it together. Last week we had the former Minister of Knowledge for the Ecuadorian government, and that was amazing. And that was the first of these Zoom sessions. And today I'm really pleased to have Koen van Seyen with me. Have I got your name said relatively
Absolutely.
well? Yes,
Absolutely.
I've been on a learning journey over the last few minutes just to get that one right. And today we're gonna, you'll do a better job of introducing yourself than I can, Koen, but the topic that I'm interested in for us to chew through today is to get a basic understanding of regenerative agriculture, which I know you have a podcast which focuses on that amongst other things. But why don't you give us a bit of an intro to yourself and what you've been up to and what brings you here today as well?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not a farmer. I don't come from a farming background, but I've been always very interested in food, like many people liking good food, etc. But I really discovered or stumbled upon, I think is a better phrase, the potential of regenerative agriculture in 2011. So I was working at a investment fund focused on sustainable aquaculture. So anything to do with fish farming, insects, algae, seaweed. And I basically stumbled in 2011 on the concept of regenerative agriculture, which basically flipped a lot of my thinking on its head. And the focus of regenerative agriculture has been, and there are actually people that have been doing this for quite a while, of growing soil. So really taking the principle, if you call it in investment term, assets, like how can I restore the land I have as a farmer or land user? And I saw some of that potential in 2011, not necessarily from the food angle, but mostly from the carbon angle, which is something obviously you've been discussing a lot. And if we restore a lot of soil to its healthy state, whatever that might be, we actually store a lot of carbon. One of the biggest storage places of carbon has always been soils, and we've been with our agriculture and with our land use have been releasing a lot of that. So a lot of the carbon in the atmosphere actually comes from soil. Obviously, a lot can be stored in trees, like you've been doing with your tree planting, but healthy soils also store a lot of the carbon. And that triggered really something. When I saw some of those numbers, in this case it was in Australia, I read an article. I can send you actually was a chapter of a book. And there was a lot of carbon. And I was like, wow, why is nobody talking about it? It was 2011, just to frame it. And I started following it, and I started reading and trying to connect with people who were doing this. And there were partly permaculturists, partly regenerative farmers, partly large scale farmers that were making changes. It was a really broad movement. And so that had been very interesting. And I was working with these investors that were interested in food and agriculture, but never understood when I was explaining soil, like when I was sharing how different management and integrating trees into farms, etc., could really be beneficial. So I thought, maybe I'm not the best storyteller on that front. And what if I start recording something? What if I start recording these conversations I have with people, with farmers, with scientists, with fund managers that are doing this? First of all, I get a great talk because I can spend an hour with somebody that's doing something very, very interesting.
I know the feeling.
And I have something that I can actually share. Which was 2016 when I started the podcast, literally to interview people that were doing this at scale, so regenerating soils at scale, with a commercial mindset. So how can we put money to work? How do we can get it back? How do we can actually have produce of it? How can we do it in a way that we can do it at a larger scale? And I started sharing that with the investors, with the people that maybe were on the other end, so the putting money to work side of things. So, and that has been now 3.5 years ago, and it got a bit out of control. It's now, it turned into a small company. It turned into more than, I think we did 90 plus interviews, some very long, some very short. And obviously I had the great pleasure to learn a lot along the way and share that knowledge basically publicly, as my journey was and is public.
And what is the name of that podcast if people want to go see it?
Yeah, it's very, we chose, I was very lucky in terms of choosing the name, investing in regenerative agriculture. So
Okay.
if anybody is searching for the combination of those two words, regenerative agriculture or regen ag, and investing, they find the podcast because there's only one. And so that has been very interesting. The audience is a mix. It's really investors, so London City people, Amsterdam people, Wall Street people that get very enthusiastic when they discover the potential. And it's the people on the other side that are doing this at scale, that are, or at sometimes very small scale, large permaculture operations, etc., that are starting to think about money. And do we want to raise it or not? Do we, and if yes, how? And how can we interact with this investor finance world, between brackets?
And so is that what you do full time now, or do you have a day job as well?
No, it's part of my day jobs. I would say about a third of my time goes there. I spend another 1 to 2 days a week with Tonic, which is a nonprofit of active impact investors globally. So I work a lot with investors that are not only interested in food, but they definitely are. So they're interested in education, they're interested in solar, etc. And I work with an asset manager in Italy where we are focused on regenerative food systems. So I spend a good 2/3 of my time focused on food, agriculture, and also quite a bit of renewable energy.
Well, that's a fantastic spread of both networks and mind share. Putting your mind partly in the frame of a farmer and partly in the frame of an investor. The worlds of
I try to be
economy.
the bridge, and it's fascinating because the languages are so different.
Yeah, the worlds of economy, the language of economy, and the language of ecology can be coming from opposing paradigms. And I guess that's one of the things I look forward to discussing with you is there a place that it can meet in the middle? But firstly, before we go on, let's establish some real basics here. Where is your accent from?
I'm Dutch,
You're
originally
Dutch.
from the Netherlands. Yeah.
Yes. And are you there now? Where are you? Where are you?
No, I'm now in Italy, actually. I mean, we're
Okay.
in a crazy period, obviously, and I'm mostly based out of Italy,
Mhm.
but also a bit in Netherlands. So we're quite nomadic, but obviously in this COVID era, nomadism is a bit difficult. So
Yeah, yeah.
I wouldn't say
Well,
stuck, but a bit stuck.
Well, we'll be hopefully, if we can, if we're lifted from the sanctions of isolation, we'll hopefully be on tour as a community in November, and maybe we can come down and see you in Italy as we
It would be
go
great,
through.
yeah.
But and then let's establish a couple of terms for people that
Yeah.
where this is all new. What is agriculture?
So I would say agriculture is the practice of using land, and I think that's an important one because we obviously there's a huge space as well. We obviously often don't talk about in agriculture, which is aquaculture and sea. There's a lot of interesting things happening there, but I somehow focus mostly on agriculture so land to produce food, fiber, and oils. I think so almost everything you wear, if it comes from cotton, etc., if it's not petroleum based, everything you eat, a lot of cosmetics, it's a lot more than just food. And I think it's good to remember that because it produces most things we do, and it has an enormous impact, both negatively and positively, on our world.
Pretty much, you could almost say pretty much everything we make. Everything we make with materials of some kind. Obviously a
Yeah,
song.
as long as it's not fossil fuel based, which
Yeah.
obviously a lot of plastics are, but almost everything else
Mm.
somehow grew somewhere. And
Yeah.
even fossil fuels, but that's a much older story, obviously,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
is based on somewhere, someone that has farmed or worked the land, managed the land.
Mm-hmm.
And we influence a lot of hectares or a lot of acres in the world. If you look at
Mm-hmm.
the size of, like, compared to, for instance, the size of cities, we have to probably show the numbers in the show notes, but compared to the size of cities, the impact of agriculture in terms of land mass is just enormous. It's so big. And you see that when you take a train or a car or a flight.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. And then a term, the other term you use is regenerative. And explain what you mean by regenerative and what the other options would be if it wasn't regenerative.
Yeah, sort of naturally, the other option would be extractive. And I think you can put most of the agriculture we've done and are doing currently, especially currently, but also in the history, many civilizations have disappeared because they have over extracted. Basically, you should see it as a bank account. If you keep extracting money from a bank account, at some point, and you don't put anything back, at some point it's going to run out. So have a very extractive agriculture system where we see a lot of negative impact from runoffs to CO2 to obviously a lot of effects in terms of healthcare. We have been talking a lot about sustainable, so I would say one level up, where we need to be less extractive, we need to be sustaining the soil, we need to be sustaining the system we have. And not even too recently, I think the term was coined in the 50s or so, but the modern version of the term, I think, is only 10 years old. And of regenerative agriculture, like sustaining is not good enough, because if you look around and you see the current state of the ecosystem, why would we want to sustain that? So you see a bigger push now, and you see a bigger push every day almost in, okay, what if we bring back that ecosystem, or what if we regenerate it? So it's really a step beyond sustainable, because we don't want to sustain the current situation, because the status quo is honestly not really interesting to sustain. Also, we want to go beyond.
It's also bloody boring. I mean, who wants to live a life that's sustainable? That's not anybody's. That's a very, you know, if you're an artist or a creator, there's nothing exciting about that story of a life. That is about living a that's very low on the hierarchy of needs. If you're in a bad
staying
way,
alive,
if you're in a bad way, you look to get to a minimum hygiene level, but that's not what you're aspiring
to. Or if you're in a relationship and somebody asks, how is it going? It's sustainable. Nobody would get really excited about that. I mean, except if you're a divorce lawyer. But so it's really about that fundamental, and I think it's a very interesting discussion, because you can start discussing regenerative medicine. You can start like, do you want to keep this body alive, or do you want to regenerate it? Do you want to keep this soil alive? And there are very similar discussions there to be held. And before we become extremely like this sounds amazing, but that's probably impossible. There are farmers around the world, very small, very big, anywhere from 1 hectare in Ghana to gigantic farms in the US, that have proven that in agriculture, very short terms, in our terms quite long, so 5 to 10 years, they are able to restore their soils and to go way beyond what we thought was possible, mainly by changing management. So not by buying any fancy equipment or fundamentally changing all the seeds, but mainly by changing the way they farm. And I think that gives me at least a lot of hope that if a lot of farmers and land users change the way they use the land, for us at the end, because it's not that they are the bad people in this story. We created a system that forced them to just focus on quantity. If they change with us, with our help, the way they manage, a lot of very interesting things can happen on the landscape, which become a lot more beautiful, honestly. If you make an excellent point as an artist, the landscape now is very boring, very dull. If you look, especially in the winter, it's plowed and basically not very interesting and appealing to look at. And why should that be? And I think a lot of people have shown around the world, from Australia to like all different sizes and different continents, that it doesn't have to be that. It's very difficult to imagine, if you're used to seeing your land very boring.
Yes.
To imagine that something else is possible. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges here, is to imagine that that's actually can be done.
Well, in my world, and with the advice I've received from those farmers that I know, there are 4 qualities that I care about in any land project. One is, as you've mentioned, the soil quality, growing the quality of the soil and the level of topsoil, which grows slowly but is very important. The biodiversity, how many different species of animals and trees and plants are in a particular hectare
and in the soil. Like that's the same. That's exactly the same. If your biodiversity in your soil is very low, your soil will never be healthy.
And then the third is obviously the carbon content. Are we able to take molecules that were contributing to heating up the planet, and are we able to put them back into the ground and back into wood, into solid format, so they're not contributing to that greenhouse effect? And the fourth one is food, and you've talked about that as well. So for me, those are the 4 qualities. It's like, how, if I was to rate any piece of land, I'd be looking at where are they at on these 4 metrics, or 4 qualities, if you will. Does that make sense to you, or do you think there's something omitted from my equation?
No, I would. Speaking to a lot of people, it seems we can even make it simpler, and they. Obviously, I'm not a soil scientist, but a lot of people keep saying that the level of carbon in the soil, and if that's going up, is a very good proxy for all the others. Like if the level of carbon is going up, it means you hold more water. If the level of carbon is going up without doing any tricks, like if you bring an enormous amount of compost, obviously you're tricking the system, which might be necessary at the beginning if it's extremely degraded. But it's a good proxy, seems to be, for all the others, because if the level of carbon is going up without any tricks in the soil, it means that you probably have a good diversity above the soil and also in the soil. And so it seems like that seems to be, and there seem to be interesting tipping points there where if you get to 2.5%, I'm just saying a number, please don't quote me on that, then suddenly other things become possible and suddenly the soil starts restoring quicker. And obviously it depends where you are, how badly degraded the soil is. But it's interesting when you talk to these farmers that they can talk for a very long time before they start talking about their produce, before they start talking about the food they grow, they talk about the soil. Like the really interesting regenerative farmers sort of care more about the soil, which makes a lot of sense because it's their asset at the end, and it's that's the thing that keeps everything going. But they care more about the soil, and then what they produce on top of that is sort of a byproduct, because it could change as well, and it depends on where they are in their journey, it depends on where they are, and obviously
it's like values in a community. If you have solid values, then all sorts of good art and good relationships and good care and good vision and bravery will all come out as a byproduct of the good values.
And without that, without that, anyway, nothing would come out. So it's a very, and I think we have neglected that. We've tricked, and we've for very good reasons, obviously, to not have ever hunger again after the Second World War, especially in Europe, and to really pump a lot of chemicals. And to sort of imagine that it's just a blank slate. Whatever you put in plus chemicals, it stays fine. You harvest it, and that's okay. And we're now starting to find out with a lot of research that that's actually not so much the case.
It also reminds me of what I found in the woods when I was making fires every day. Was because the topic that unites these two subjects is the concept of emergence, the idea that all of a sudden incredible emergent appearances or happenings can occur. And, I think it's such a crazy thing with fire because you've got a certain algorithm of heat, material to burn, and oxygen. And at some point, the difference between fire and not fire is not one more notch up a belt. It's absolutely explosive, and it goes boom. And then it can disappear again, and then you just blow on it and increase the oxygen content in the algorithm, and boom, off it goes again. And it can go on and take on the whole forest if you don't look after it properly. So I am fascinated with and familiar with the concept of emergence through my trying to wield the power of the fire to cook my baked beans when I lived in the woods. So it's an exciting to be around. We talk about, like, when we go back to that sustainable being boring, emergence is exciting, and the beauty is
and scary. But if you're a farmer that has, like, the current extractive system is very plug and play, you don't have to think a lot because somebody comes on your farm, which is your extension officer, that sells you also the chemicals and inputs and gives you a menu, basically a playbook. This is what you have to do, this is when you have to spray, this is when you have to do that, etc., etc. You don't have to think. And you're in a system, and I'm not saying that you cannot think, but it's very difficult to go from that to an emergent where you're going to figure out, okay, what can I grow and what should grow on this piece of land? For the next 20 years, what's your vision, your dream? And to sit down with farmers and do that is fascinating, but very, very difficult, because we created a system where all of that talk should not happen, because you just have to do X, Y, Z, and then in the end there should be A, but usually it doesn't, because there's weather and risks and insurance, etc. But it's a very plug and play system, and we're asking farmers to change to a much more fluid, flexible, emergent, what should happen, what could happen, what do I want to happen, what is the context, etc. And so that's a huge mind shift.
Yeah, well, it's from control to co-creation, isn't it? It's from domination to relationship. And, like I said, with new agreements, the concept is always about whether it's society or in ourselves or in our domestic household, what is the kind of relationship that we need to thrive. And I think what you're describing here is, as somebody moves from a dominating or controlling system that's like maybe thought out by somebody else who comes to them and gives them the solution, taking more responsibility, but actually holding more space for nature to talk back to you and say, hey, this is what we would like to grow here. This is what will work well.
Stop
And not just
stop
saying,
fighting that something. I mean, many of these farmers that have made the transition, and it's never that they are done, because they only go deeper and deeper and deeper. But stop fighting what wants to grow, because for now we're trying to kill what really wants to grow, wheat, which is a horrible name, and many regenerative farmers have done with that, and like wheat pressure and all those war terms. Stop trying to kill what wants to grow, and stop trying to keep alive what actually wants to die, which is in many cases your monoculture crop. And really switching that, and you're absolutely right, control. Like, you're not in control of this, and many farmers know that, but acknowledging that fact that it's actually not you on the steering wheel is very, very difficult in any situation, obviously, but also in this. If you have put all your life in it, your father, your grandfather always did it like that, and all your neighbors are doing it like that, and you're going to be the one saying, I'm going to leave my fields a bit messy. And let's see what grows. But that means I've heard stories. Yeah, but I've heard stories that then your son is not being picked in soccer team anymore locally. Like, this is peer pressure at its worst. And still, it's actually a miracle that many of them, the gurus we now look at that have very successful operations, that they somehow made it work, often through a very big crisis, because they simply, nature was very, very much telling them, please don't continue. They were either broke, and they couldn't buy pesticides anymore. So they started experimenting with cover crops, or they had the worst drought in their history, often through very big crises. Many of the ones we now read the books have changed because of that.
Yeah, exactly. And before we go on to some practicals, because it would be great to hear one or two examples of places you've visited, or indeed places that you think are like best in class, as an example. Just a couple of other terms that you mentioned in there, which would be worth just trying to pull out and make sure people get. So we're talking about this sort of scary, wild kind of partnering with nature that can come out of a different mindset. But you then mentioned sort of monoculture crops. So this kind of agriculture that we've been used to, which includes often monoculture cropping. Can you explain a bit about what that is and what the alternative is?
Yeah, sure. So the best way to probably think about a monoculture is if you're in the car, on the bike, or in the train, and you see one crop next to you. So you're looking to the left or right, obviously not when you're driving, and you see one row of corn. It could be sweet corn, etc. And so monoculture really simply means one crop on the field. And often you're not the only one, meaning all your neighbors are doing that. It's very difficult to find a monoculture in nature, because nature doesn't like it. It will figure out a way, it will figure out a way to, for something to make it breakfast, meaning that there will be some pest that loves the monoculture and has the day of its life. And what you see with regenerative farmers is a number of principles. So it's not a recipe book, and that makes it very difficult to repeat, because somebody said, okay, I would love to do this, give me the book. And because it's so place-based, and because it really depends on the context, there's a number of key principles that many of these farmers around the world, both on the small scale, some are fully organic, some very, very little, maybe spray every 10 years something if they really cannot deal with it. Maybe some are completely GMO free, some are fully biodynamic. It really is it's quite a mixed bunch, but there are 4 key principles that most of them follow. One is simply complexity, meaning complexity on the diversity on the farm and in the years, meaning no monocultures. They're usually 2, 3, sometimes 4 crops in the same field. Imagine the messiness of the field. And of course, you have to then figure out a way to either sell the 4 crops together if they are harvestable at the same time or not. Then you have to, if they're not, you have to figure out a machine to harvest them at different times, meaning not killing the other one. And so there's a lot of complexity involved, but diversity on the same piece of land and over the years, meaning not the same crop or the same mix of crops over the year. So they do complex rotations, which could mean that the same field doesn't see corn plus a few other crops for 10 years, just to make sure that the soil isn't ready again with the same pests. Like, look, there's the crop coming again, we're ready. So complexity, soil cover. So the soil must be always covered. So there's always something growing in the soil that takes sunlight, because that's the primary function of a farmer, of a plant, taking sunlight and turning it into sugars through the root system. So whenever you see all the tillage, like the plowed farms you see in the winter, basically you should imagine that farmer is losing sunlight now and not making sugars. You can make sugar for the soil, you can make sugar for animals to eat, you make sugar for us to eat, or you make some kind of crop. But at the end of the day, all farmers are solar farmers and taking as many solar rays as possible and turning it into sugar. So second one is,
say, just before we go on, it's almost like if you had solar panels laid out on your field.
And you would turn them around for the winter.
Yeah, turn them around for the winter, and now you're missing.
Or cover them up just for fun. Like, why would you do that?
I never really thought of plants as solar panels before, who are taking in the sun and in order to make it into sugar.
And if you look at the complexity one, the first point I made, that's why complexity is so interesting, because you have different crops at the same field, which means they have different heights, which means they have different leaf structures, and they take different pieces of the sunlight. Different rays, different times of the day. It might be some are much earlier. So you actually capture more sunlight and you keep the ground more covered, which is great because you don't lose any water. So the ground is always covered, which means there's always a cover crop, usually very mixed. There's always something growing either for the soil or for us. That's more or less the deal, because you don't want to lose any of the sunlight and you don't want to evaporate any water.
So we've got complexity and soil cover. What's number 3?
There is a big group of these farmers that are integrating livestock at some way, which is we're going to open a whole can of worms on vegan and vegetarianism, but you see a lot of the large scale farmers, regenerative farmers, that have been able to build soil, that somewhere in their complex rotations are using livestock. Why? Because they might need to mow down the cover crop to be able to direct seed something else. Instead of using a big tractor, a lot of diesel to cut the cover crop basically and make it ready for another crop to go in, they use livestock to do that. And if you do that, let's say holistically, and if you do that very strategically, there are now some research coming out that you're actually you're sort of turbocharging the soil, and you're actually storing a lot more carbon. So it could even be carbon positive beef, which I know sounds like a joke, but they're actually very respected LCA, so life cycle assessment research coming out on how the right type of animal at the right place, the right time, is an interesting tool to build soil faster.
I think that's one of the bits of complexity that are missed in a lot of modern practices, full stop, is appreciating the complexity that's baked into that sentence. Something that is in its right place at the right time, the right thing in its right place at the right time. Now that sounds incredibly simple, but the amount of care and knowledge of both the moment and the history of knowledge of the practice all need to come together in a beautiful symbiosis to get an answer of whether it's right to put that pig in that field today or whether next year will be better, you know? And I think that is that kind of age-old farming wisdom that is so, as you said, simple yet complex at the same time. And it's something I can appreciate anybody with good timing, because I know that.
And timing is everything in this case. And it could be people, I know farmers that are timing it almost on the hour, meaning that they have the cows getting through, let's say, a pasture, and they know in that type of pasture, that land, also that piece of land, how long it takes for, it gets a bit gross here, for the maggots to come out of the cow patties, basically.
Wow.
And they need to time it exactly right when they send in the chickens, because they will eat the maggots. But if they are a few hours late, it means they're already flies, which means that they will lose that. So it's and it depends on the farmer. It depends on the place actually where you are, how you work the timing. Imagine the rotation schemes, because these livestock are moved once or twice and sometimes 3 times a day. It's a very complex like orchestra you're trying to build there. So that's number 3. Livestock, it's not for every farmer, but many are doing it at scale, are somehow integrating very smartly, very holistically livestock in their operation.
I'll just say one more thing on that. The best example of timing that I've seen in recent months is I lived with my sister for a month before Christmas, and she has at the time, an 18-month-old baby. And I was shocked at how much of a 24/7 job it was. In some ways, she was doing almost nothing, because they're just in the house all day long together, often sleeping, often just chilling, you know, playing. But actually, it was completely relentlessly 24/7. And I think for me, it's a pretty good example. And we do talk about farm husbandry, don't we? And in this sense, it's not husbandry, but mothering. that what I observed is that it took my sister absolute complete dedication of attention to do the simple things well at the right time, to provide milk at the right time, to provide lunch at the right time, to provide sleep at the right time. And actually it wasn't complicated, but actually it was a deep care and attention that's required to do the simple things at the right time. And if you didn't do it at the right time, you would have tragedy and trauma. And so I think that in a way that sums up the best analogy I have for, we need to move to a farming of motherhood, not of machinery or something like that, of dominating machinery. I'm just reaching for metaphors here, but I think you see where I'm coming to.
No, absolutely. And I think it's also daunting for many farmers. Obviously, if we go back 100 years, we had a lot of mixed farms. Doesn't mean necessarily that they were regenerative. It doesn't mean currently, if you look at organic, especially industrial scale, if it's regenerative. I would always push your farmers, if you have the direct relationship, to see if they're growing soil and if they're measuring that. But it's a big undertaking if you integrate livestock. It doesn't always have to be you, obviously. I mean, you see a lot of these new examples where new agreements actually, where people are letting livestock of others basically grazing their fields for an X amount of time, providing a service to both parties, and then but not owning the land underneath, and doing that for a number of farmers. So there's a lot of flexibility, depends on local laws, etc., to make that work. But there's a lot of flexibility and stacking business models, because some might run the chickens, some others might run that, some other run the vegetables. So there's a lot of new flexibility. Instead of one farmer with his wife, which is the traditional, you see a lot of these new ones are 3 or 4 couples, or are different processes and different mechanics and structures, luckily.
Well, yeah, that exactly. And the farm that we've been working with in Scotland, they're called the Future Forest Company, and where their model is good is because they are running effectively 4 different businesses on top of each other on the same piece of land. And you will come on to agroforestry in a bit, but what's the 4th quality?
The 4th is probably the most, basically David Montgomery. If you want to read a lot about regenerative agriculture, David R. Montgomery wrote a great book called Growing a Revolution. He's a geologist, so he came to the space basically looking at, we can never, like, topsoil takes 10,000 years to grow a few inches. And he found his whole group of farmers that actually did it in 5 to 10 years. So he wrote a great book, and he said his first is always ditch the plow, like stop plowing, which is not completely true, because if you want to do potatoes, you still have to somehow get the potatoes out. So usually you get it summarized, or onions, you get it summarized into minimum soil disturbance, but definitely not with an enormous plow going 50, 60, 70 centimeters under, turning the whole soil upside down, which means all the microbes that were perfectly happy living 50 centimeters down are suddenly on top and basically get baked in the sun. So the 4 are minimum soil disturbance, which is the last one we talked about, complexity both in time and space, so never the same crop too much in the same place, or never a monoculture, and also over the years as much diversity as you can handle, which is obviously, it depends on the place. The soil must be always covered, something must be growing there, taking sunlight and turning it. And in some, but actually quite a few cases, the integration of livestock. And then you have a very exciting mix, and then it's not boring anymore.
And so, in your own experience, in your own travels, have you been to see some farms? Have you met some
Definitely, yeah. I've been, many of the podcasts I did obviously are distance, like we're doing now. But I've had the pleasure to be in farms in Germany, in California, in the Netherlands, obviously, in Italy. And visited quite a few very, very interesting farmers.
Will you tell us a story of one that's maybe most exciting, but where also maybe how the ecology turns into economy as well? Just because that's obviously where the rub is here, is this is all good having these qualitative values, but does it and can it translate into quantitative values that also help you pay your electricity bill and put your kids in school and things like that?
Sure. I think probably the best stories of a farmer just south of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. it's a 350 hectares, which is quite large in the Netherlands, very small in Australia if you compare it. Very traditional, was a very traditional potato onion farm, and basically selling to supermarkets. So the normal, what you would imagine if you look at that. I think more than 10 years ago, they started looking at soil, and especially 8 years ago, they started really focusing on growing soil. And in the Netherlands, a huge issue is the compaction of soil, because of course and so one of the first things they did, which is actually quite a big investment.
Of compaction of soil.
So basically, if you're running a lot of heavy machinery over soil, the soil slowly will, and which means that your roots cannot go down. That's very simple. So they have a lot more trouble going down. A lot of water stays on the land. So you see these huge mini lakes basically on top of land, which means there's not a lot of air in the soil. There's not a lot of space for the water to go down. And actually a lot of your crop can die. So what this farmer did was taking all of his tractors, which are the big John Deere ones you can imagine, and basically changing the wheelbase and making them all the same width. So I think it's 380 or something like that. And they didn't come like that. So he spent quite a bit of money to make sure they were. And what he did was, with all his GPS, because it's a very advanced drone-driven, etc. farmer, is that every year he only drives on the same lanes. So when he's planting, he knows that exactly those 20, 30 centimeters for one tire and 20, 30 on the other side, that's where he never plants. But in between, he always plants. So the pieces that are compacting are only on the sides where the wheels are. And as always, machinery is exactly the same. And he obviously, that's a shame for those pieces where he's always driving, but the compaction reduced a lot in between. And he saw in the first year, he basically got the money back for that. Wow. And they started going way beyond that. So they started making their compost tea at an enormous scale, obviously, because you're making compost tea, which is an extract from the compost you're doing. Normally you do that in permaculture, etc. In this case, you need to do it for hundreds of hectares, which is interesting. And they started really, really focusing on the soil. And probably the best example of what that did is last year was the second year they had a drought in the Netherlands, which is very funny because there's never a drought. It's not funny actually, but it's weird because of climate change. But it's interesting that we're talking drought in the Netherlands. And they didn't have to water. And I think their neighbor watered 6 or 7 times, meaning with the normal sprayers, you see the water going. And just the diesel cost of that is 10,000 euros a week, just for just the diesel pump.
The diesel, obviously, there's loads of diesel as well.
Just for the pump, pump, and that's one. And they planted about I think a month after. So the potatoes went in a month after their neighbors, and a month later they already caught up in terms of growth. So their soil is so alive, and they're only 7 years in, and they are still relatively in the commercial system, so they cannot do all the stuff they want to do. But if you just see the water saving, obviously the water and the diesel saving, and how much healthier and alive their soil is, so the plants caught up a lot more, and they had a really good crop while they were officially a month late.
So just to clarify then, he made a transition to allowing the soil to breathe more instead of compacting it all. And you're
stop spraying. A lot of other things, obviously. They stopped spraying. They really started, everything they do is try to grow the soil while being a commercial potato farmer. So that's not an easy balance, but
but my point is that in the first year, it only took 1 year for him to see the reward. So it wasn't a 10-year bet, 20-year bet. It was a 1-year bet. And then my second question then is, how did he come to this knowledge? So, because he may be small compared to Australia, but he's large in his culture.
He saw 2 lines. He saw literally the line of slowly the growing yield that we always used to, because every year we're going up in yields, etc. He saw that going slowly plateauing and probably even going down a bit. And he saw his cost going up. And he saw at some point those 2 are going to meet. And the moment that happens, like, first of all, why is that happening? And second, the moment that happens, my farm doesn't make sense anymore, because my costs are going to be higher than my yield, and my yield is going down. So how can I, first of all, think about higher yields? Now, that was a very difficult question. But how can I bring down my cost? How can I understand? And he came to the conclusion, everything we do, his wife is a biologist, so that helped a lot, is soil. Like, everything we do is soil. And the moment that revelation came, then everything changes.
So what I'm asking though, one, yield means the amount of food he can generate,
grain,
right?
potatoes, calories per, or the tonnage per acre. Yeah.
Tonnage
Per
per
hectare.
acre, yeah. And so his wife had some knowledge of the ground, which probably helped him. But also, did he see smaller scale examples first that fed him, or did he just look at the data from scratch and say, "I think this could work, so I'll try it"?
I think that we live in a very interesting time because you can Google and you can go to YouTube and you can see examples of potato farmers doing very interesting things.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if he had seen it before with his own, I mean, with his own eyes, like if he was in a field of a successful one in France, etc. Definitely now, yes. But we live in a time where you 2 clicks away and you order a book like David Montgomery, or 2 clicks away and you see a video of someone doing things that you never thought was possible. So, and that was already the case in 7 years ago. And now it's, I mean, there's an amount of sharing happening in these communities. It's very, because everybody's figuring out, how do I plant 4 different types of grains and how do I harvest them? I have no idea. Maybe somebody did it. Okay. And so there's a lot more possible now. And obviously the best thing is to actually visit farms of other people that are on that journey. I don't think anybody is done. Everybody is somewhere on that regenerative journey and just making it more complex almost every day.
I guess I'll ask you the question instead then. In your experience of talking to different farmers and knowing the space, what is I'm always interested in the minimum viable experiment. So
usually cover crops. Usually somebody that says, I harvested my grain for the year or for this season, and instead of leaving my land fallow, just leaving it like that, as we see very, very often, it starts to become much more accepted to plant something else. And usually the idea was you plant it so it takes nutrients, and so next year my crop will suffer. And actually now it turns out that that's not the case. If you plant something for the soil, so you run a crop that you're not going to harvest, it's not going to be for you, but it's going to be to recover, to store nitrogen, to do something for the soil. And that is probably the easiest with one type. I mean, the experienced ones do 15 mixes of 15 types that all feed the insects in a different way in the soil, etc. But that's the simplest one I've seen is just not letting your land do nothing, and so one type of cover crop and see what it does for your next year.
So that's a good practical example then. But what about scale? Like, you know, is it helpful people trying to do small scale experiments on 1 acre, or is that just not helpful?
Yeah, I see many farmers won't gamble their full farm. They would do, also if they're switching to organic, which takes a 3-year period, they might do part of their farm just to see if they can get it under control, just to see if the markets are still there in 3 years. I don't see any farmer going from 0 to 100 in a year. I mean, it's always a gradual process.
Okay, cool. And so before we get on to the sort of new agreement side of what we think we should be all sort of agreeing to do and head towards, if we put your investment hat on for a second then, given all the knowledge that you've shared, which has been really, really good, and some of the best practices and examples you've seen, if you were looking around now, if I gave you £1 million or £1 billion to invest on my behalf, what kind of agricultural projects would you be looking to sniff out? What do you think provides economically? So assume the qualities are there, all the qualities we care for are there. Mm-hmm. What kind of scheme, or what kind of scheme do you think would provide the best return on my million, or let's say billion, whatever a good number is?
It's a very good question. I ask it sometimes in the podcast, and especially to people that are not used to think about a lot of zeros, because I think the space, our space needs to start thinking about larger numbers, because there's a lot of interest and there will be people asking literally this question, and no offense, but people with maybe $1 billion in a bank account. Mm-hmm. And it's, I mean, I don't have investment advice and I'm absolutely not allowed to give that, but I think the answer would be a mix. The answer would be a mix and we get to that probably in the new agreements. A big chunk of that would be partnering with farmers. So mm-hmm. meaning sitting on the same side of the table, yeah. And actually figuring out how to invest in their transition. Mm-hmm. And that those are experiments that are happening now. And so maybe there's no space yet to put your billion, but there's definitely space to put a lot of experiments, and there are interesting returns. Like these transitions are interesting. They need to be done well. I mean, they can go horribly wrong, obviously, but there's a huge interest from large companies to buy these kind of products. There's a huge interest, luckily, from the audience or from the public to get better food. And there's a very interesting, which is a whole other can of worms, but there's a very interesting relationship between healthy soil, healthy produce, healthy gut systems, and healthy people. And that whole discussion as food as medicine, I think, is something we're going to have a lot more. So we'll definitely invest in that, like high quality, nutrient dense food, which comes from healthy soil. So we have all the benefits we talked about, but also have interesting margins because they are in a different category. They are almost medicine like. And I think there's an interesting case right now, if we had to put it to work, like we're April now, if we had to put it to work very quickly, there are interesting places where it makes sense, and that's another discussion, to buy land and regenerating it, to buy land and put big agroforestry systems, because you store a lot of carbon, you produce a lot of cacao, for instance, or coffee and bananas, and they are interesting investment cases where you can get a good return. And that's sort of part of the sector where you're buying land, so it becomes yours, and you're regenerating it, is also maybe a bit more mature and can thus absorb a bit more of the 1 billion. But I think the most exciting pieces are not happening there, are happening on the partnering with farmers and figuring out how to do that, not with 10, but with 10,000, and then from 10,000 to 10 million, because we need a lot of farmers to transition, and which means we need to partner and not be on the other side of the table. So I would spread it and definitely do a piece in research. Obviously, there's still so much we don't know, but I think most farmers in the space, the regenerative farmers, are half scientist, inventor, and farmer, which means there's a lot of applied research being done actually in the fields, because people are trying a lot of things.
Yes. Okay, cool. And so just before we crack on then, what in the context of everything you just said about creating, decent food returns on this land, it makes me think of wilding and rewilding, because that's certainly a new wave over the last 3 years or so that people have been quite excited about. The idea of, it speaks to some of the values we've described about giving agency back to the land. But I've been over and spent the day at Knepp Castle, which is...
I'm jealous. I was planning to go these months, but yeah, we can't.
Well, it was fascinating and wonderful. I can't help but notice that there's no food there. I mean, I want to go back and stay, and they're making more money than they
There's
were
some livestock,
intensively farming. And there is more wildlife. So lots of the qualities are there, but there ain't no food as far as I can tell. So what do you think the place of wilding, if there is one place for wilding, rewilding at scale, is in amongst the picture you can imagine?
I think there are 3 places for rewilding. I think, first of all, they are producing food. I mean, they're producing very high quality semi-wild meat, but obviously that depends if you're eating animal protein or not. I think they are exploring 2 very interesting pieces of the 3. One is, how do you integrate rewilding into farms, like into large, because every farm has pieces that are simply not very productive in the normal sense of the word. So they might cost a lot of money to maintain. They might actually not yield so much. So how do you integrate it in terms of hedgerows, in terms of how do you make the current farming more diverse, more complex, and how do you integrate wilding? How do you create these corridors? I think there's a lot of, that's the easy piece to get done, because a lot of these pieces aren't farmed anyway. They're sort of left. I think the fundamental piece in rewilding is that it is partly managed. Like, it's not completely, we put a fence around and we wait. In this case, in Knepp, they very deliberately took a combination of animals and kickstarted nature, basically, because if you would have put a fence around and waited, these large animals wouldn't have come back, and there would be a different...
big lake as well. They made a big...
So there is that piece of, when the ecosystem is so degraded by us, obviously, we might need to at least partly manage it and then sit on our hands and partly manage it a bit.
Like a life support machine. You need to
put a
life support machine.
There is some management needed, and I think that's something we need to understand. It's not, you can just leave it and it doesn't grow back to a super rich ecosystem unless it was quite rich recently. Another piece I think is very exciting. They are not exploring that, but what happens if wilding is part of your rotation? So if you have a 50, 60, 80 year rotation, let's say something, which is, nobody does that, but let's think you have, and of that 15 years is proper rewilding managed, but very wild, what would happen to the nutrient content of the food that is grown after that? So after the 15 years, it goes back into complex rotations, maybe with the tree still part of it, maybe not, depending how you design the system. But I would be very curious if you would go grain after that, regeneratively, obviously. What would be the grain? What would it taste like? Because the soil must be so alive. And maybe after 10, 20 years of some kind of regenerative farming, you would put it back to wilding. So you would make it part of the rotation. I think that's something we're going to see some tests and some exploration in over the next years, because it's very exciting what it does to the quality of the food and nutrient density, to the soil carbon. And I think there are many pieces of land that are simply absolutely not profitable, like their piece was now. And if we cut down on food waste, if we cut down on animal protein fed by grain and corn, I think there's a large surplus of land we actually don't need, and we can have a good discussion about what would a rewilding project look like and what do we want to optimize for. Is it biomass, biodiversity, animals, insects? What do we want to? Because there's a lot of land we currently farm which is simply unnecessary.
It's interesting what you say about thinking about rotation, but on a larger scale and also on a time scale rather than just on a geographic scale. So it's easy to imagine like doing wilding over on this field for a while, but you're actually saying, what if you do it over time as well? I guess it just made me think, what if you could take that to its full extension as well and look at the world as a farm and consider, well, maybe over 100 years, this area of the world we should be wilding, and then maybe the next 100 years, this area we rotate where the wilding and where the things happen around the whole world. And I'm not saying there's a use case for that yet, because our communication and governance structures haven't evolved there yet. But that's the logical conclusion of taking it up in levels, and that's, I've never thought about the whole world as one piece of nature before that could be rotated over time.
I think it makes a lot of sense to think in landscapes and bioregionals and to think in ecosystems within this whole world and figure out what is the optimal, because we've never done that. It's usually been a farmer or a land user deciding on his or her piece of land, and probably that's far from optimal. Like if you're discussing agroforestry, it matters a lot where you plant that tree, and it matters a lot which tree you plant, and it's going to be there for a while, hopefully. So if you look at a landscape level, you might want to say, I actually want to plant there within this river shed or watershed and not there. And maybe in X amount of years, if we look at climate models, then it doesn't make sense to have that certain crop anymore here. I mean, there are a lot of those questions, what to plant where and why, that we haven't really ever thought about. And maybe now with new computing power, et cetera, we can start answering some of those, or at least provide some indication to figure out, okay, if we're going to plant a lot of these trees in farming systems, and we like productive trees, which one and where and how and why? Because then we probably have to look at a much larger scale than just, even if it's a huge farm, just one farm.
Yeah. Well, let me now we're on trees. Let me, I mentioned the agroforestry project we work with, and their model's cool because, as I said, there's 4 different businesses, like the wood products, the carbon offsets, the pigs that they run, high quality pigs, they act as their little machines running around doing the work, fertilizing and such. And then the actual food that grows on the trees as well. And they run all those 4 businesses on one piece of land, and like take the birch syrup, sap as well, and things like that. And that's what produces the returns, plus owning the freehold of the land is like the business model, if you will, over time. My thesis, and I'd love just to hear just 1 or 2 lines from you on it, is, so we're in a carbon deficit time. You know, we've only got 300 gigatons of carbon left to emit, and if we carry on the current path, we might do that in 8 to 10 years, and after that the odds aren't great of not warming the world too much, to 2 degrees or whatever. So there's 2 ways: reduce how much we're emitting and the rate we're emitting, and also take some of that carbon and lock it back away to sort of increase our budget before we hit that moment. And then my research shows that trees are really good, but obviously they start really small, and then they take a while to become really powerful carbon capturing machines. So that we probably need 1 trillion new trees in the world to kind of deal with that, a meaningful amount. I think with 1 trillion new trees, we could meaningfully hope to get 200 gigatons of additional carbon budget in the world, right? So we've got 3 trillion trees at the moment. We're talking about 1 trillion extras. And then this is the bit I wanted to discuss that comes into sort of my theory of change, if you will. So 48% of the land in the UK, I believe, is agriculture, meat agriculture. So animals and grain for animals to eat, because obviously they take loads of food to keep alive through that time. And obviously you've got this, as you mentioned, the force of veganism and vegetarianism on this side. And I guess my theory is that if we took so it's a global thing, the trillion trees, but if you take the UK as the example, because that's what I know the most data about, if you basically incentivized farmers to take half of their meat land, both grain and cattle and stuff, and turn that to forest land, agroforestry, so we're still doing half the meat production and resources for animals, but half of that land, so 25% roughly of the UK, becomes agroforestry land, then I think it would be fair to say the UK is then doing its part to contribute to increasing our carbon budget through the production of trees. But obviously, like we've talked about, carbon in trees and in soil is a very helpful metric to measure, but actually it can lead to all the other qualities we care about as well. We would just need to get used to getting our protein from nuts and things like nuts, and not eating so much meat. And so that's kind of like my theory for change there. What does that sound like to you?
I would actually ask, in that agroforestry system you're imagining, would livestock be integrated or not?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy so far. I would love for you to meet Jim, who I'm working with in Scotland, and see what you see. Well, let's connect you up, and you maybe have him on your podcast or something.
It would be great. Yeah,
they raised money. They're doing really cool stuff. He's a very smart guy. But as far as I can see, his model is a best practice model. So I would be interested to know if you came to the same conclusion. And in his model, he is running pigs wild in the trees, eating some of their 90% of their food they're eating from the forest. Mm-hmm. And then they do some work in fertilization, and he does sell that. So it's not that there's no pigs, but there would no meat produced in that land, but just far less than would be if it was intensive pig farming, you know?
Yeah, I think there are a number of points there. One, I think the difference between ruminants and non-ruminant animals. So a pig needs, and a chicken as well, needs actually quite a bit of grain or outside feed. So if they can do 90%, that's very high, but you usually have to feed them something extra. They don't live, at least the ones we have breed, they don't live in the forest and will be fine. Cows and sheep and goat are very different, as they can eat grass. And that's a very fundamental, they don't need anything else. So I think the starter of the discussion for me would be any animal that, or the cows and sheep, etc., we're currently keeping inside. So if you look at the data on probably the size of land needed to keep those cows alive, it's not because of the cows, because they are inside, it's because of the grain they need to feed. So that doesn't make any sense. They have 4 legs to walk. They naturally eat no grain and no soy imported from Brazil. They eat grass. So I don't think any of those animals should ever be inside. Our tendency to try to get very, very cheap meat, often obviously full of chemicals, and there's a lot of research coming out now, which is very scary, that the antibiotics we give to animals actually obviously hurt us as well, should end. I mean, there's no way, why would you grow grain, ship it halfway across the world or halfway across the country and feed an animal that's inside? I think we need to have a discussion, should we eat animal protein or not? And there's a second discussion, which are 2 different ones. Is there a role for animals to restore land or not? I think the farmers I know show that there is definitely a role for animals to speed up the regeneration of soil, especially if you do that in an agroforestry and silvopastoral way, which means that cows are, or some type of cow, sheep, etc., are integrated with the tree systems. They have a role to play there, and they kickstart, or they grow the soil much faster. Then there's the second question: should we eat them or not? I think that's a personal question. That's a discussion we'll have as a society. Do we want to eat our fellow animals or not? But the first question, which I think is very important now, as we have 8 years left, can they play a role in quicker storing more carbon, either in the tree? Does the tree grow faster when it's half being eaten or not? Does the grass grow faster?
Yeah.
Does it store more carbon? And I think there the answer is yes. So I would look at that 25% you want to put aside, or like, what is the optimal system, which might have animals, might not, might have robots doing something, I don't know, to store as much carbon, and thus regenerative biodiversity, store as much water as well, but let's focus on the carbon piece, as possible, the fastest. And most systems, if you look at Drawdown, the big research piece, there is some kind of system that includes trees and animals, but done in the right way, which store most carbon both in the trees but also in the soil. And I think that symbiotic relationship is something we have to use. And then we have another discussion, which is a very profound one: should we eat them or not?
Yeah, I think you're saying you haven't got an objection with my scheme, but it would
no. But I would definitely, if the animals would help, I would integrate them because it would go faster.
Yeah, same. Great. All right. Well, so as you know, the podcast is called New Agreements. So we've been talking all around regenerative agriculture, but as you sort of sit here today, and it doesn't have to be something you commit to forever, but as you're sitting here today, if you had to write a new policy or a new agreement for us in society right now in the world we're in 2020, is there kind of a new agreement that you think we should all be agreeing to or heading towards?
I think it comes to the old saying, I have no idea who said it, but we are what we eat. Mm-hmm. And we should really see food as our medicine, and hopefully you're not sick, so you don't need medicine. But there's a lot of research coming out on that connection that I mentioned before: healthy soil, healthy produce, healthy gut system, and then healthy people, and obviously healthy ecosystems after that. And we have, I don't know if we've forgotten, we always say it: you are what you eat. Think like, what is your gut feeling, etc. And we're finally getting a lot of that research data and a lot of that experience, and it has to do with flavor, etc. So I would really say we should approach food as our medicine and not as fuel, as we've done for maybe in the Western society, obviously for the last 20 years. It's been something you eat at your computer. It's been something you just need some calories or even a drink, and then you get enough of the nutrients in it. It turned out to be a lot more complex than that.
Yeah. And so is part of that a nutrient thing, and part of that a mindful eating, being aware of what we're eating and having a stronger connection?
Absolutely. I think there's enough to show that if you eat very fast, it doesn't help. If you eat in front of the TV, you eat more. If you eat with other people, you eat slower, and you enjoy it in a certain way. I think it's definitely, it's more than the food on your plate. It's also how the plate looks, how the food looks. If it's not boring, if it's exciting what's on your plate, if you have exciting people around you, and like, if eating is a moment, and of course it's difficult for people that are now alone in an apartment somewhere locked, but definitely use Zoom to share. Like a meal alone is something I think very, in especially ancient societies, is something that just shouldn't happen, because it's
and so in light of what you want to see there, of the value going up in how we think about our connection to our food, in order to have healthy bodies and guts and that, is there something you would like to see governance put in place to help people to do that in their daily lives? Like, I often think about the seatbelt, seatbelt in the car. It's not a decision that we let individuals make, because there's no point. We know it's safer. The data is in. It's just better if you wear it. We don't need our freedom on that one. We have a freedom to choose whether to drive or not, but if you're going to drive, you wear it. And I think there is a good role for governance in helping us save ourselves from ourselves a little bit sometimes. So is there a role that the government could play, a policy that the government could play, that could help us to save us from ourselves when it comes to what you're discussing?
It's a tricky one because, of course, I mean, there are examples like the sugar tax in the US, and I think transparency laws are very, like, label laws, probably making labels easier to read. I don't think
Hmm.
anybody would be, except for some food companies. But knowing what's in your food, it starts with that. And if it has more, like Michael Pollan says, more than 5 ingredients, or there's something you cannot pronounce, or your grandmother wouldn't recognize as a type of food, if that's an ingredient in something you're about to buy, probably don't buy it. So making it easier to see real food and eat real food, I think it's because we've been tricked in. I think sugar has, I don't know how many names on the label,
Yeah.
and it's not so good for you. I mean, but to say like there shouldn't be sugar in it, because then we'll figure out a way to put something else that's equally bad in it. So I don't know if I had one policy. There's a lot of bad policy in it, especially on the farmers level, that are really prohibiting farmers to do these things we discuss,
Mm.
because simply they wouldn't get a payment from the government if they didn't plow.
Right.
Or they aren't eligible for insurance if they plant more than 2 crops. Like very silly things that weren't designed like that. It's nobody that came up with this, but because
Yeah.
that was the mindset when the crop insurance in the US was designed. And so you have to do this, and this, and this, and there's no way to innovate. And many farmers cannot lose that insurance, because if they have a dry year or wet year, that's their safety net. So I
Yeah.
think it's, in this case, it's probably more removing a lot of the bad unintentional ones. I wouldn't
Mm.
say bad, maybe unintentional ones that just created a lot of issues. There are many farmers that plow just to get the European money in Europe, and they know it's bad. They see their soil erosion. They see the soil flying away when
Mm.
it's very windy, but otherwise they're not eligible for certain types of
Mm.
payment. So I think in this case it's about removing a lot, and I
Mm.
think on the consumer side, on the transparency, and as we're getting closer to easier handheld devices to measure nutrient density on the spot, which are a few years away, then it becomes maybe mandatory to have every supermarket to have one of those measurement tools that you can just measure the nutrient density and measure the healthiness of the food. We're
Mm.
not there yet, so we cannot make a policy on.
Well, I'd love to know, are there any projects that are working on that I could follow?
There are actually the Bionutrient Food Association, and the founder of that is Dan Kittredge, who is working on that. Specifically, the size of your phone, maybe twice the size. I have one of the early prototypes, not
Oh,
here
wow.
actually, and it's very interesting. Like, it measures the nutrient density. Of course, you need all the software to tell you, okay, this level of nutrient density is good
Yeah.
compared to this other apple. But the promise of that is quite interesting. And there are some other people. Jill Clapperton is one who's been working with actually a piece that they use in musea to basically, I see a painting behind you. If you want to measure what's the content of the paint without scraping off a piece of Van Gogh, it's a proton gun they use to put it close to, and it basically measures what comes off. And she has tweaked that to basically measure the nutrient density of meals and of food,
Wow.
of grain mostly. So there are quite a few people working on this, and they show very interesting result. Like, the same type of grain grown differently could have massively different zinc content, or massively different other things that we really want more of because we don't
Mm.
have enough.
Interesting. Two things that come up for me as you've been speaking. One is that I often think that all policies that get put into law should have an expiry date, and that
That would be very interesting. Yeah.
because, like,
Yeah.
on the basis that laws should, if it's working, it should just get renewed like a lease. You know what I mean? Like, at the moment we treat laws like freeholders. It's like yours in perpetuity. It's there in perpetuity, rather than, hey, we put this rule in because it's helpful for us at the moment, and we should review it in 30 years time, or 10 years time, or 100 years, depending on the length of the subject that we're discussing. And
That would
some
be
of these things
interesting.
that
Yeah.
you're talking about, stuff that's ridiculous now, that needs to, it's almost like all the demand is on the innovators side, rather
All the
than,
risk as well. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, rather than any responsibility on the conservatists side, saying, you know, because it's going to carry on unless someone does something about it. And the other thing that made me think is, when we're talking about making labels more clear for the consumer, I wondered you could whether you could show the journey of soil quality, or maybe carbon density, of the soil that the product you're buying has come from?
You could probably, I mean, blockchain obviously is going to help a lot in this. You could, but you'll be surprised how many companies, if you buy a normal pasta or cookie in like a bag of cookies in the supermarket, have no idea where the raw ingredients come from. They might know a country, but they bought it somewhere on some kind of exchange and marketplace. And there are very few companies that have that deep knowledge from plate to soil. And that would be able to say, okay, but actually that grain came from there, so we know. Many others don't have long-term agreements. They are 4, 5, 6, I don't know how many steps away from the farm and the farmer. So that would be amazing, but many would have something like, I don't know. And it changes probably over time because they use every week another supplier, or every week it comes from somewhere else. And that's one of the issues actually, because it got anonymized into a commodity market. And even if you grow amazingly quality grain, as long as you're above a certain threshold, or you sell it to a local miller, if you go into the commodity market, you get the commodity price, and that's
you know, we don't have to worry about the whole market. We can worry about, are we able to find one farmer who is willing to provide that data when they sell their tomatoes? Are they willing? Is one farmer willing to provide that data when they sell their lettuces, and say, this is the carbon soil journey I've been on for the last 3 years? And so anybody who cares about the metric you're describing can know that in this case. And actually, it leads me back to a podcast a few podcasts ago with Jesse Baker from Provenance, who does really great work on supply chain and origins of anything, really, so that consumers like you and I that might care about that could actually be satisfied. And I think she would be quite encouraged to see this conversation and describing that. So I would love to.
I hope so. I enjoyed her podcast. So that's
Oh, good. And well, if you come across any farmers that would be kind of already, maybe they're surfacing that data, they're already on a carbon soil journey, it might be that we can connect them to Jesse to start as an experiment, really, to start making that data available on the blockchain, so that, because it might attract some new buyers, it might help them to sell their products, because there's certain people who are making things that would be desperate for that data, and barely any farmers are providing it.
No, absolutely. I think just a word of caution for us. So measuring soil carbon is not easy, and there are many different ways, and it fluctuates literally like the earth is breathing. This is what the earth does when it breathes. So it's not that you easily have one number. Of course, you need to run it. It's possible, costly, and not so easy, but it becomes easier. And there are many people actually working on better ways to measure it and to calibrate, etc. And I think there's an interesting, it opens another discussion, but there's an interesting project being worked on in, not too much in Europe actually, but mostly in US and a bit Australia, etc., which is run by Dr. Bronners in Patagonia. And they're working with the Rodale Institute, which is one of the main, let's say, regenerative agriculture research institutes. And they're launching basically a regenerative organic certificate. So they're launching another certificate, and that we should have a discussion if that makes sense or not, but they're doing it. On top of organic, because they say organic is good, got us a long way, is definitely not regenerative. In some cases, actually quite damaging for the soil. Says nothing about social. So we're fixing it, and we're putting a label on top of that. So you have to be organic to start with, but we're measuring soil health. We're focusing on social. We're focusing on farm workers' health, which is obviously a huge issue. And so they are trying to basically to update organic and really get to a new level. And they're doing tests and trials with a lot of farmers, from wineries to potatoes, basically around the world, to figure out, does this make sense and how does it make sense? So it's quite an interesting, it's ROC, Regenerative Organic Certificate, to see if that takes off or not. And the first products, actually, Patagonia launched their online shop, because obviously now they're not selling online, they're not selling offline, with produce and products that have that certificate, and you have different levels, I think bronze, silver, and gold or something. So there are people, but then I don't know if the label says like your organic level, or your soil carbon level, which would be interesting.
Well, we manage what we measure, don't we? So the better we get at managing, the better we get at focusing on it, the better we'll get at measuring, and the better we'll get at managing it. That's the way I think about it. Even if it's not perfect now, it's better than only hearing it pop up now and again in a niche podcast. You know, we want it to get into.
Of course, no, we need to have a regular conversation with your farmer at the farmer's market about his or her soil carbon levels. That would be really good.
That would be cool. So Koen, anything else you want to share with the listeners whilst we're still on?
Yeah, I think if you're interested in, I mean, maybe you've heard about soil before or maybe not. I think there's a lot to find online. I mean, not necessarily just our podcast, but there are a lot of interesting books, a lot of interesting videos. There's a lot to discover. Kiss the Ground is a very good book, first of all, and also a very good project. So you can search for both. But I would also really encourage you, whenever you can, restriction-wise, is to go and talk to farmers. Find farmers that are going beyond organic, going beyond sustainable, that are building soil, and you'll be absolutely surprised what they're running into, the issues. It's absolutely not easy, but go in, because many people I see now getting very enthusiastic about this stuff and wanting to launch brands and ag tech companies, etc. And I always ask, when is the last time you talked to a farmer? And that's often surprisingly a long time ago or never. And I think we need to really partner with, and that needs to be in the finance space, in the technology space, in the consumer space. We're all consumers, to really partner with farmers. And that means we have to sit down at the kitchen table and listen. And I think that's something we don't do nearly enough with the people that at the end produce our food, grow our soil, produce our oxygen, clean water, and anything else.
So just to finish then, on a really practical note, if somebody wanted to sit down and have a cup of tea with a farmer, and they don't have an uncle who's a farmer, and they live in a city, and they don't have a podcast, which is kind of like a calling card to go and have a conversation with someone, then like, how do you recommend? Is it by calling a farmer and saying, I might like to buy some of your things, can I come and talk to you about them? Or I might like to come and work on your farm for a day and also talk to you, and maybe I could help for a day and talk to you at the same time? Or, you know, what do you have any advice on that? Because a lot of people wouldn't know where to start with calling a farmer.
Very, very good question. I don't know. It depends where you are now, obviously. Many places have farmers markets. Obviously, some are canceled because of the crisis.
That's a good point.
It's the best place to meet farmers. They might be small, they might be slightly bigger, they might be a bit weird, they might be super friendly, but you find a lot of farmers. So find someone you click with, you like their food, first of all. You like the taste of it, because at the end, it comes down to taste, and nutrient density and taste is very closely connected. And then what you suggested, can I help you for a day? Can I learn? Can I see? And can I understand more? I think it's something surprisingly not many people do.
And my experience actually with farmers as well is they're living in a different century often to what I'm used to. So if you just have an iPhone and you know how to make a video and to share it on Facebook, that might be a skill that they really value, just being able to share.
It depends on, I have to say, it depends on the farmer. I know farmers that bought the very first drones for 15,000 euros, and they get an amount of data that would scare most tech companies. It depends. I mean,
of course, and other farmers
it depends on the generation.
Online at all.
No, but go and listen, and it doesn't mean you have to record it. Maybe yes, maybe not. But if you want to learn about soil, go to the soil.
Well, my experience is farmers don't sit around doing nothing. So generally my experiences with farmers have gone better when I offer something, when I'm either offering to buy something or I'm offering to help do work. And I'm just saying that our nativeness in digital, you might not think about the skills you have online, but that can be an offering.
Of course, yeah. Especially as many now need to start selling online. And if they haven't done that yet, or selling directly, and it's a huge shift for many farmers. And there's a huge opportunity for all of us that are more used to that to help them out, because the ones that are selling direct are having a boom that they never saw before in this crisis. The ones that aren't are in trouble. And so there's a need for us to go and buy direct, and maybe help to get some more of the direct consumer to get it off the ground.
Amazing, Koen. Thank you so much for taking the time to educate us and let us into your world.
Thank you for your questions.
Regenerative agriculture, and so many links in there for us to follow up. Hopefully you'll ping them over and I can put them in the description. A couple of links there for you guys into some of the other podcasts. Definitely worth checking out. Jesse Baker. We've got another podcast coming next week, hopefully next week or soon, on blockchain side of things, which will be interesting as well. Thinking about how data flows from the soil all the way through to the consumer's kitchen. And yeah, really appreciate your time, Koen, and hopefully we'll stay in touch and maybe cross over and cross paths again at some point later this year.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care of yourself.